All right, moving on. We've got a couple AFC South teams, 3 AFC South teams, all coming up in a row here. How hard could it be? Starting with the Houston Texans, Sam. And their big need, this is kind of like when the Raiders traded Khalil Mack and their biggest need was pass rush, even though it was a good trade for the Raiders. The Texans need a primary option at wide receiver, according to PFF.com. Who's to argue?
Nobody. I mean, it's difficult to make any argument that doesn't say that. They traded away a number one wide receiver, one of the best in the NFL, and now their number one wide receiver is Will Fuller, who is often not healthy. So, yeah, they need receiving help, and they need a lot of it because their receiving core wasn't great even with Nuke Hopkins there. So, yeah, it reinforces how insane the trade was because it's not like they even have a ton of draft capital to go and make that happen.
They got the 8th overall pick in the second round. So that will be the first time that the Texans draft. They don't have a first rounder, obviously. So they have the 8th pick of the second round, the 25th pick of the second round. And then after that, just 1 3, a 4, a 5, and 3 7s. So a team that does have, they came into the offseason with massive holes. Wide receiver, not one of them. They're still sitting here in the offseason with massive holes. Wide receiver, one of them. Now, if they want to have an explosive passing attack, now if they want to go, like I said on the last podcast, if they want to go full Deshaun Watson equals Lamar Jackson, we're going to run the ball like crazy and actually take the ball out of Watson's hand. That's one thing, but the receiving core needs help. They bring in Randall Cobb. They have Kenny Stills. They have Will Fuller, as you said. They still need more there. They don't need to get a number one option like DeAndre Hopkins. It could just be this, let's spread the ball around and all that. But the secondary is the big question mark for me. They bring back Bradley Roby. They could be one of those teams that thinks, hey, we spent a second on Lonnie Johnson last year at corner, and he wasn't great, but he can develop. But bringing in Eric Murray and bringing back Vernon Hargraves, it's a lot of patchwork in that secondary. To me, that's the biggest question mark, though, for the Texans outside of the receiver question.
So the receiver question, though, just sticking on that for a second, I think one of these first-round wide receivers is going to slip into the second, right? Partly because this draft class is so deep and so talented, I think teams are going to be like, look, we can wait a little bit. We don't need to go crazy in the first round. We can leave some of these guys for the second and third. So if you're the Texans, are you trying to replace the skill set of Nuke Hopkins or just the fact that he is, the unquestioned number one target and the guy that Deshaun Watson is going to want to go after? Because a guy like T. Higgins from Clemson seems to me like the receiver that's most likely to fall out of the first round because of the questions about his speed and his athleticism and the fact that, separation was never exactly his greatest calling card in the first place. Even though he can separate, I think he's, the one with the biggest question mark in that regard. But I don't want to directly compare him to Nuke Hopkins, but he's got a lot of those things working for him and, former Clemson receiver.
Yeah. Other people have made the comp, even outside of the Clemson deal. I don't think you need to replace that skill set, but, I'm a big believer in having different skill sets at the receiving position. And when you have an under 30-year-old Randall Cobb, as we realized on the last podcast, can still work the slot, and Kenny Stills and Will Fuller are your speed receivers. Having Nuke as the possession plus receiver, a big-bodied guy, was great. So, yeah, I think a Higgins would be a good fit there. The thing with Watson is he's aggressive, and he needs a guy that's going to bring aggressiveness out of him because like Joe Flacco was aggressive early in his career because he trusted Todd Heap and he trusted Anquan Bolden. He had guys to throw to. Once he lost those guys, he became like check down Joe and no longer had any value, with his big arm that could drive the ball down the field. There is some danger of that with Watson. So giving him a guy with ball skills like a Higgins that he can trust even when he's covered, I do think makes a lot of sense and could be the guy at the top of the second round. And then the trade is like, all right, it was T. Higgins and David Johnson for DeAndre Hopkins. Still doesn't look great, but I don't hate the idea of trying to replace him.
Right. Still a terrible trade, but at this point, it's about damage limitation. And can you actually replace 80% of Nuke Hopkins at the top of the second round and somehow come out of this in not a disastrous situation, which is what it looks like it is otherwise? I think T. Higgins seems to me like it seems like a natural sort of confluence of the way this stuff might unfold. Him slipping out of the first round, the Texans not having a first rounder, but desperately needing to replace that kind of skill set. The Clemson connection between Hopkins, Deshaun Watson, and T. Higgins. There's a lot of stars aligning for that to be the pick at the top of the second.
Yeah, either way, they're another team that's wide receiver and corner. If they did get a Higgins at the top of the second and then circled back, you might get some guys that are fringe first rounders on the PFF draft board that are still there. Late second, Jalen Johnson, the corner out of Utah, AJ Terrell out of Clemson, Jeff Gladney out of TCU. I think any of those guys could still be available in the second round. Our draft board's always going to elevate corners higher than probably the NFL likes them anyway, so we think you'll be able to get some good value right there. But I think, the Texans, they just haven't replenished their roster since making the power move to go get Deshaun Watson. They've gone the other way, losing a ton of talent and just not getting enough draft capital back to replace them. And that's what's put them in a tough spot the last couple of years where they had to draft offensive line. And now they're in a point where it feels like they have to draft secondary help and wide receiver help because of the moves that they've made. So that's the issue. It's like the opposite of what we've described with the Bills. The Bills did a really nice job of filling out their roster with either solid players or a star like Stephon Diggs, and now they can draft whatever they want because it's all gravy at this point. There's no glaring need. Like the Texans are going in to the draft with glaring needs, which is inherently risky.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we talked the whole purpose of free agency is to eliminate glaring needs so that you can draft well, you can draft efficiently. You don't have to chase specific players at specific positions because if you don't have that starter, you're in real trouble. You can say, all right, in a perfect world, we might like a wide receiver, but the value is too good with this defensive lineman that's slipping. We're going to take him instead, and it's not going to harm us long term. The Texans have not done that. They've done, in fact, the exact opposite of that. And now they need the draft to plug giant holes in the roster, which is just a dangerous way to be approaching it, particularly when you don't draft until the second round. Like if you were picking third overall, it would be one thing, right? Because you're like, all right, we have a glaring need, but we pick at 3. We know that a quarterback and somebody else is going in the first 2. We are like 95% confident we're going to be able to pick or fill this spot with the one player that we want that answers all of our problems. That's not the worst idea in the world, though I'm not sure it's sound process. But the Texans don't pick until the second. Like anything could happen. Like there could be a run on the positions they need, and suddenly they're left. Either you have to try and trade up to stop the run, and you don't have the capital necessary to do it, or you just have to take the next best guy available who's not going to fix your problem.
No, do not just fill out the depth chart in the draft. Got to get valuable players and guys that you think are good. All right, let's move on to the Indianapolis Colts, a team that hasn't made a ton of moves this offseason, but they're all pretty big ones. Anthony Costanzo coming back at left tackle. The O-line is now locked in. They traded for DeForest Buckner. Obviously, they signed Phillip Rivers as well. The more you look at the Buckner trade, and you did a good job of laying out how they had to hit the salary floor, and we said they have this combination of really good long-term building, and now they can afford to tack on a Phillip Rivers and throw a DeForest Buckner long-term contract in there. The other thing is they have the second pick in the second round, and they have the 12th pick in the second round. So even though they gave up 13 overall, they still have 2 pretty valuable picks as far as the second round goes. And I think their biggest need is pretty clear here. It's finding receiver talent for Phillip Rivers, and for the 80th time in a row, we're going to reiterate some of those receivers are going to be there at the top of the second round. And the same guy that you were trying to give the Texans, T. Higgins, feels like a very Phillip Rivers-y type of receiver potentially in the second round there.
I think T. Higgins is a very Phillip Rivers-y receiver that would help. I think my boy Denzel Mims, this is actually my boy as opposed to everybody you want to label as my boy.
Your real
Denzel
boy,
Mims,
Denzel
I think
Mims.
makes a lot of sense. And again, I think he could be in the second round as well. I don't know that he's going to elevate himself into the first, given how strong this group is. So a guy like Mims is, a do it all receiver that has a, very big bodied, physical, does basically everything that T.Y. Hilton would not be considered particularly strong at. So again, a perfect match, A, with Phillip Rivers, and B, complementing that offense, or to complementing the fact that they already have T.Y. Hilton. And then the other question mark is Laviska Shenault, because he was the guy that, ran in the 4.6s because he ran through injury, is A, going to be getting injury fixed, and B, probably not going to have the chance to redo those numbers because of all the draft chaos. Is Shenault a guy that starts to slip out of the first round because there's now question marks that we aren't going to be able to get answered before that? Again, bigger body guy that can do a lot within that offense that T.Y. Hilton isn't necessarily suited to.
It's funny because I wonder if the exact scenario you just brought up, and we've done a lot of content right now saying, okay, what is all of this stuff? How's the draft going to be affected by everybody being on lockdown and all that stuff? And we said, look, the teams are probably going to be a little safer. They might not take a risk on an injury concern or a character risk or whatever it is. But I wonder if this is the draft where if you have a ton of 3rd and 4th round picks and the Laviska Shenaults of the world fall just because they can't run a pro day 40 or whatever it might be, and you just gobble up all those guys. We talked about that last year a lot for Jeffrey Simmons, right? The teams that, like the Raiders were the team we kept saying they have 4 picks in the top 40. They should absolutely be taking Jeffrey Simmons. And he went higher than we expected, even at 19 overall to the Titans. But I would be the team if those guys fall to the 3rd or 4th round. Man, if I had I would use all my 3rd and 4th round picks on character concerns, guys that couldn't run, that are really good football players, all that stuff. So it's a good point on Laviska. If they did add a Higgins, you're talking about an offense that added Paris Campbell in the 2nd round last year. They still have to figure out how to unlock that potential. And, you can keep him as a gimmicky type of player like he was at Ohio State. You have a T.Y. Hilton. You have one other receiver to throw to. I just don't think you want to develop Paris Campbell into wide receiver 2 because there's still so many question marks if he can do that. So I think it's almost definite that the Colts are going to grab a receiver with one of those 2nd round picks. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a major question mark as to whether Paris Campbell even has that in him. Like when you watched his targets at Ohio State, he didn't run receiver routes. Like him being projected as a wide receiver was a hell of a stretch because he didn't play that at Ohio State. He played gimmick.
Right.
And there were so few routes where he actually ran like legitimate pass patterns, NFL pass patterns, and was expected to play wide receiver, that sort of projecting how he would be able to do that based off a few snaps here and there and the fact that he's really fast was a hell of a stretch. So, I mean, he might be able to, but it's very much projecting an athlete that can do a few good things into a completely different role. So, year 2 is, I'm sure they have a decent idea of where he is in that development process, but it's by no means a sure thing that, year 2 is the year that Paris Campbell gets it and steps up into this role. But for all we know, he's never going to have that skill set and they'll be moving in a different direction. Equally, they might have loved what they've seen from him in practice and think he's, really heading in the right direction. Actually, they're looking for number 3, not necessarily, a viable number 2. It's all sort of where they are internally with Paris Campbell's development based off practice reps and all that kind of thing.
Among the secondary needs for the Colts, edge rusher and corner, I would just keep an eye on some of the long corners in the 2nd round as well. The Trevon Diggs, or the taller corners. Trevon Diggs, Cameron Dantzler. If Bryce Hall's there, still in the 3rd, another guy coming off injury.
Yes.
The Colts have added a ton of 2nd and 3rd round corners the last couple of years, but it's not like they're completely stacked at that position. Rock Ya-Sin, Marvell Tell, Kenny Moore, there's Quincy Wilson. There's more to add at corner, so wouldn't be surprised to see more size added to that defense in the draft.
Trevon Diggs and Rock Ya-Sin would be a pretty A, physical, and B, imposing cornerback duo for the future.
And I'm still waiting to see if they're going to start playing a little bit more man coverage. They've been as zone heavy as any team the last couple of years. Getting one more Rock Ya-Sin type of press man corner might be what opens that up a little bit for the Colts. All right, staying in the how hard could it be AFC South, Jacksonville Jaguars. Biggest needs. I think, we've talked about, are they back in the quarterback market? maybe not, but more specifically, cornerback now. They go from having Jalen Ramsey and AJ Boye the last couple of years to just massive question marks outside at corner. Offensive line still needs some depth and some help, and interior of the defensive line is another place. But yeah, top to bottom, this roster needing some love.
The Jags feel to me a little bit like the Minnesota Vikings in terms of, are you entirely sure what it is they're doing? Like, they feel like they're in the middle of like a full-on blow-it-up rebuild, tank for 2021, et cetera, et cetera. But then they do still go and, give around some decent money to guys like Joe Schobert. They've signed some players that I don't know that you would bother with if you were in full-on 2021 tank mode. I guess the franchise tag on Ngakoue can go either way because potentially they're still trying to deal him, even if they're not.
Trade him. Yeah.
Even if they're not, it's probably worth keeping him around for a year because he's a good player and he wants out anyway. So it's better than letting him walk. I guess you can let him walk this time a year from now. But obviously the move to trade away Nick Foles and roll with Gardner Minshew, they just feel like a team that doesn't have a particularly strong and solid and clear franchise direction.
They're going with the competitive rebuild, Sam. That's what I like to call it.
Competitive rebuild.
Competitive rebuild. Yeah,
is that actually
I might have to. I think it goes back to my conversations with my wife Kelly. She said, "Look, you can't just breed losers to try to get the number 1 overall pick. You want dudes that win and that are going to be a part of the rebuild, but at the same time look to the future more than the present." So, look, Gardner Minshew. We joke about Ryan Fitzpatrick being tank proof. Gardner Minshew might be too good to tank with.
Yes,
like he's pretty good. So yeah, they're in an interesting spot. I don't hate their spot for the long term because they've got the 2 first-round picks this year. Maybe they can still steal another one for Yannick, at some point. But I like the idea of looking forward for Jacksonville. I thought they screwed up. And maybe not get another first-round pick, but get some sort of value back for him. There's a lot of rumors there.
I get something for him. He's giving him a first-round pick.
I just think it's weird. It's got to be frustrating for the Jags that they spent 6 years of drafting in the top 10 to peak for 1 year and then start it all over again. That's the frustrating part. If you have 6 years, you should be able to have a sustainable good team for at least 3 or 4 years.
We were, looking at teams. We're doing. I don't know if anybody knows, but we're doing this Super Bowl watch along tonight, where we're all going to fire up a Super Bowl from a few years ago. You, me, Eric Eager, and Chris Collinsworth, plus a potentially special guest later on in the fourth quarter. But we were kind of looking through, teams over the last decade or so to figure out who we wanted to watch. And it kind of struck me that both the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos had teams put together that both deserve more than one ring. They were able to assemble really incredible rosters and had the quarterback, whether it was Peyton Manning in his second go-around or whether it was Russell Wilson. They both had the quarterback plus an incredible team around them to be able to have sustained success. And they did. They got 2 multiple Super Bowls. They were in contention for a whole sequence of seasons in a row. And, things just broke against them and they were only able to come away with 1 ring each. The Jags almost did the same thing, except the difference is their quarterback was Blake Bortles, who was only able to half avoid incompetence for 1 year and then went completely in the tank and ultimately was bad enough to completely override everything that they built around him. And that's ultimately the problem, right? Is that quarterback is so important that if you have a great one, he can override almost everything else. But they're also so important that if you have one that's bad enough, it doesn't matter what's around him.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the big difference between Seattle and Jacksonville is obviously Russell Wilson versus Blake Bortles. But I think even from a Jags perspective, even just the narrative of what they are has changed. Again, a couple of years ago, it was why did they draft Leonard Fournette at 4? Because they didn't have any glaring needs on their team. And they felt hey, just throwing a running back on top of this thing is going to be okay, other than, obviously the quarterback position. But now it's all right, they could still use more on the D-line, which used to be loaded. Their secondary used to be loaded. It's a big question mark. Last year at this time, we were saying they've got one of the worst groups of playmakers in the NFL. At least DJ Chark emerged, but still a massive question. They have question marks at all the most important positions on the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other reason for Leonard Floyd is that they recognized that they had a disastrous quarterback and tried to take the ball out of his hands as much as humanly possible. The problem is that there's basically just no way of hiding a crappy quarterback in today's NFL. Like, it's not going to happen. You might want to try and take the ball out of his hands as much as possible and run the ball, but unless that guy, unless the quarterback can himself be a major part of the run game, like Lamar Jackson or Taysom Hill even, right? You can't, unless you can build an offense around them that leans on the fact that they can be massive rushing threats, you can't affect the fact that you ultimately need him to pass the ball efficiently to some degree. And Bortles was only able to do that for a brief period of time. The fact that they brought Leonard Fournette on board basically didn't affect it one iota. Bortles was still crushing Fournette's production because of how bad he was playing and the fact that teams didn't have to do anything to deal with it.
All right, as far as draft capital goes, Jags are in pretty good shape. They got 2 firsts, both 9 and 20 overall. Yeah. 10th pick in the second round. They have a third. They have 2 4s, 2 5s, 2 6s, and a 7. So they're a team that, could do some maneuvering. I think they're a team that can do some maneuvering for next year. I do think their best strategy, start to flip these guys into the future and then get into that Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields sweepstakes. As much as Gardner Minshew is valuable as a 6th rounder and it's a cool story and all that stuff, like, you're still in the Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence sweepstakes. So I think using, some of these top picks to start looking ahead, like Miami did last year at this time, I think would be really smart for the Jags.
Yeah, that makes
Tennessee Titans to wrap it up this offseason. Bring back Ryan Tannehill, franchise tag for Derrick Henry, Cameron Wake's retiring, Vic Beasley's in, Logan Ryan's hitting free agency. There's some turnover on the defensive side of the ball. They trade Jarrell Casey. My concern with the Titans right now is they've been this really 9-7 type of roster because they were the team that didn't have a ton of holes up and down the board, but having to pay Ryan Tannehill, put money towards Derrick Henry, I think has loosened up some of that depth. So I think the Titans are another team. They drafted really well last year, probably have to draft really well this year as well.
Yeah, I think the most obvious spot is replacing Cameron Wake. I kind of like the Vic Beasley move, at least in terms of, rolling the dice on being able to coax the pass rushing that his athleticism says should be there. But I don't know that you can rely on that replacing Cameron Wake, who was still absurdly productive despite his age. I think you need to figure out a guy that's more likely to do that, and the draft is an obvious spot to do that. Again, the Titans are a team that's they have a spot for those lighter, faster, undersized edge rushers. So that would make a lot of sense. There's a ton of those guys in this draft that they could target and fill that role. And then I think they probably need to figure out replacing Jack Conklin. I know Dennis Kelly is scheduled to go in there and be the right tackle. He'll be a decent pass blocker, but he's not nearly the run blocker that Conklin was. And that was a big part of, Derrick Henry leading the league in rushing. So if you expect that to happen again, you probably need to figure out an alternative.
Yeah, and, so tackle depth, I think a key. Cornerback was a spot where they were rolling 3 deep with Adoree Jackson, Malcolm Butler, and Logan Ryan, as I said. But, Butler's been up and down, injured last year, so that became a hole a little bit down the stretch. They got some decent play out of random players, but they've done a good job of adding volume in the secondary the last couple of years. I think continuing to doing that. If they do get Jeffrey Simmons to, really emerge in year 2, that would be a huge win as well. But I think the Titans just need some defensive talent and, as you said, some tackle depth on the offensive side, maybe tight end as well. Another team that could be in the tight end market with Delaney Walker gone.
Yes,
for the Titans. They have the 29th overall pick. I think I keep saying the late first is a great spot for cornerbacks, but we'll see where the NFL values them. I would not hate a cornerback pick there for the Titans at 29.
Logan Ryan is an interesting player to replace for them because he kind of played all over the place for them. Had like 200 snaps in the box, 200 snaps as a wide corner, played in the slot. He was he started to transition to become more of that sort of versatile, middle of the field joker on defense. It's not as simple as sort of just drafting a corner to replace that. You need to think about, what type of versatile defensive back can replace that.
Oh, did you have somebody in mind? You're just saying that's a guy that's a tough replacement.
I was going to say that, in an ideal world, they might target a guy like Isaiah Simmons, but obviously he's going to be long gone by the time they pick. So you're sort of in this poor man's Isaiah Simmons world if you're trying to replace that. It's not, it's more complicated than basically just taking a cornerback is what I'm saying.
Yeah, they could get safety, some safety skills like Xavier McKinney from Alabama. They already have a lot of those types of players, but I liked the way McKinney covered. I think he's got some Logan Ryan-y skills to him, even though he's a safety and he's a little bit slower. But he moves really well and can cover the slot just a little bit. Ashton Davis from Cal. So if they went the safety route, those guys are versatile safeties that I think would fit, even though on paper they have a lot of safeties.
Yeah. I know there's people that want to project Trevon Diggs to safety as well. That sort of long, bigger, scheme-specific cornerback becomes a safety in a lot of schemes. It depends how the Titans project those guys, but maybe a guy like him can come in and give you what Diggs or what Logan Ryan does as more of a versatile, positionless player as opposed to replacing cornerback.
You want to get rid of me and get back to more great PFF YouTube content? All you have to do is push that button right there and subscribe. Thanks for watching.